So we're now going to move on to the next session. We're going to hear about a really exciting project called Making Space for Sand from our colleagues all the way from Cornwall. So first up is going to be the ginger Superman of Jolyon Sharpe, who's going to tell us a little bit about this project, and he's going to then be followed up by his colleague Kat. We will be taking some questions at the end, so if you want to ask anything, just make a mental note of it and ask at the end. So over to you, Jolyon.
Well, hello one and all. Thank you for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed the last few days. I'm going to be giving a very short presentation. I've got a whip being cracked at me to make sure I don't ramble on too much about the project Making Space for Sand, and Kat's going to be coming up on stage in about 5 minutes, definitely, 10 minutes. To talk about the scientific learning element of it. So the name of the project, Making Space for Sand. The full name of the project, I need to, big inhalation, is Building Community Resilience on a Dynamic Coast by Making Space for Sand. So it doesn't really roll off the tongue particularly well, which is why we call it Making Space for Sand. We also call it MS4S because, you know what, we love a good acronym, don't we? So, next slide. So yeah, content of the presentation, a little bit of an introduction to FCRIP, another acronym, an overview of MS4S, and then Kat's going to lead on the really exciting scientific learning and innovation that we'll be hopefully facilitating through the project. So first things first is an introduction to FCRIP. What is FCRIP? FCRIP is a Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme. It's DEFRA funded. Environment Agency managed. It's £150 million, which has to be spent by 2027 on 25 projects. And you can see there on the left-hand side of the image a map of where the projects are being delivered. They all have different themes, and you can see our one way down in Cornwall is a coastal theme. It doesn't mean that's all we're focused on. Of course, we'll be looking at working with communities as well within that. And the next presentation, of course, is on the map as a coastal project, but also considers catchments. So the projects are often more complicated than this image shows. Each of the projects will deliver a number of resilience actions, which you can see in the boxes on the right. There are actually 10 resilience actions. The one that isn't listed here is the influencing policy through the actions you can see there. So I think this is a real recognition that we're moving from a grey approach to a more green approach. It's about trial, learning through doing. It's about innovation and resilience and adaptation instead of a great big wall. So it's a big shift, and it's about learning from that process. I think it's also really important to say that the FCRIP is a bit of a family. I'm sure you've all worked with one another with your distinct projects, but the FCRIP project team are ensuring that we're all collaborating with one another, learning from one another's successes and failures, and that's really quite important. So an overview of the Making Space for Sand project. This is a very wordy slide for which I apologise, but the aim of the project is to have a more sustainable coastal fringe. And I think when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about it in its holistic sense. So we're thinking about making sure we've got sustainable socio-economic, environmental factors on the coastline. And, you know, it's incredibly important for a place like Cornwall. We recognise that because tourism is key. And people come to Cornwall for the quality of the environment. So it's very important we get that balance right. Data is incredibly important. We need to gather an awful lot of information so we can understand what processes are impacting on our coastline and what it will look like if we do nothing. So the data we're collecting is going to be on geomorphology, so morphology of our coastline, how it's going to change. I won't talk too much about that. Kat's going to lead in with that in a minute. We'll be learning about the health and the resilience, robustness of our dune systems. And we'll be using all of that data to work with communities and empower communities to help us make a positive change to those environments, and also help them build adapt and become resilient. Because in some instances, these changes are going to occur and we're not going to be able to stop it. You know, it's very difficult to stop sea level rise and global climate change. Therefore, we are going to have to, in some places, become resilient to those forces. I think it's really important we've got to work with community groups. It's a bottom-up. Everything that's been said previously, it kind of makes my heart sing. We've got to involve community. It's a bottom-up approach. They've got to be part of that solution. So we've got to work with those community groups, and we've got to work with the landowners to realise outcomes from the project. And what we'd like on a few sites, like with the SARCC project and your pilots, was that we want to have 1 or 2, maybe 3 locations where we can have a big win, but also lots of locations where we can have little wins, because celebrating those and promoting those is really positive from a community perspective. So who is MS4S? Well, it's everyone actually in Cornwall, including the visitors, but it's being led by the partnership. So you've got Cornwall Council, we're leading the project, and we'll coordinate interventions if we can, where we can, develop exhibition spaces, mobile exhibitions. We'll be working with a great bunch of partners who are experts in their own field. From the PCO, Plymouth Coastal Observatory, they'll be delivering, I mean, I don't talk about it, I wish I had more time to talk about all of them, but they're delivering a great project called CoastSnap. It's a community science programme where you can take fixed point photography of a number of points to the coastline, so you can monitor changes over various timescales. They'll also be adding to their incredible database. They've got 16 years of data. They're going to be adding to that and adding good quality data to that, which can then be used by the University of Plymouth, who are going to be doing some fantastic modelling of what change will look like. Again, Kat will add to that in a moment. Cornwall Wildlife Trust, a leading authority in environmental protection and environmental monitoring. So we'll be gathering baseline data, looking at biodiversity net gain, so we can see what improvements we're making to the environment through the project and after the project. And importantly, they're a great mechanism to enthuse the communities to help do their part. And last but not least, you've got Cornwall Community Flood Forum. Again, it's about getting that message out there to the public about how we can become more resilient and how we can adapt, and they will help be the mouthpiece to achieve that. So where's the project being delivered? So Cornwall is that little nub at the end. I call it a little nub. It's a massive peninsula, 700 kilometres long. Just so you can get a bit of a scale of how long that is, it's the equivalent of about 325 of the pleasure piers you can see out of the window. So it's an incredibly long stretch of coastline and an incredibly dynamic stretch of coastline. We have, the calmer southern coast, but, just 2 weeks ago, 20 foot of swell rolling in on the north coast. So we've got an incredibly dynamic landscape. Not many very large urban centres on the coastline. So we don't have lots of very long urban structures like you have here in Southend and Sea, and like many of the examples that we've been seeing in previous presentations in your coastal cities. But we do have over 300 beaches and dispersed rural populations within that. And I would talk about populations. It's a population that grows massively in the summer months when everybody comes to enjoy probably the best beaches in the world, in my opinion. So yeah, great coastline and a huge amount of pressure on those seasonally. But we've got, within all of the locations, we've got 40 project sites, and all of those locations are dynamic, very varied locations, from wide bays to elongated shorelines and coves. We've got associated with many of these locations very unique communities, and some of the beaches have incredibly complicated land ownership. Some sites have 7 or 8 landowners, so all of these things will present a challenge, and I think, again, it's been raised several times already that you've got to think about all of these factors when working with the communities. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So an example of some of the outcomes, leading in on the images on the left, the EA led on a great project in one location called Bude Adaptive Pathway Project, where they created some great visualizations of what coastal change would look like if we don't do anything. We're going to be expanding on that and developing more visualizations, and I think what I really want to develop is the sand dune time machine. Not a real one, of course, but something where you can look back to see where we've come from so that we can use that to see what we need to do in the future. So maybe a DeLorean, maybe a VW van. I'm not sure. It's going to have a flux capacitor, whatever we do. But it's a really good way of getting people to understand that actually the coastline was different before we developed it. And actually, in some instances, we're seeing new erosive processes, but actually sometimes it's the reclaiming of what we've developed. But, you know, so I'm very much in agreement with a lot of what I've heard, using the history to indicate that things are changing. We'll also be looking at having exhibition spaces, so we'll be creating some space at Heartlands, which is down at Poole, where we'll be joining the South West Climate Change Centre, where there's great information on Forest for Cornwall, carbon neutral Cornwall, flood resilience. So we've got loads of projects. We're all coming together to share a space where we can educate the public, and of course we'll take the time machine on a road tour as well and educate communities. Baselining is key. We're going to be collecting lots of information on the ecological health of the dunes. So we need to start with where we are now, so that we know what we need to do to go to the future with outcomes. And I think most importantly, I've put some images in the lower right-hand corner of some of the various groups we want to work with. We've got to work with champions. You know, the beaches are used by the community. We need to make sure that we're working with the community to deliver outcomes, and this is a great way of doing it. Finally, we haven't actually decided on what we're going to do yet and where we're going to do it, because we need to be engaging with the public first. But just a couple of very quick examples of some of the interventions we could consider. On the image on the left, you can see a car park. One part of it's very low lying. We could allow that to naturalise, to become a dune system, and move the car park to more resilient geology in a nearby area, thereby making space for sand. And in the image on the right, you can see there's a community that suffers from fluvial flooding and also from tidal surges. So there may be a need at locations like this to close the beach car park, move some of the community infrastructure to more resilient locations, and work with that community about how they can become more resilient to flood events. So that's just a couple of things that we could do. But like I said, we first need to work with those communities to see what they would like to see at the locations. They're very much part of the process. So I'm going to end my part of the presentation for now and hand over to Kat for the next bit.
Thank you, Jolyon. Let me start by saying that Gert Masselink is academic lead for Plymouth University on this project. I'm project manager, and the team also includes another 5 academics and researchers and 2 PhD students who will also be working on this project. Now, I would believe that all of you in this audience have a good appreciation of how important dune systems are, both in terms of their coastal protection and from an ecological perspective. Hence, we've been listening to all the work that's been going on over the past 4 years. So, as such, they've been studying quite extensively, and we now do understand quite a lot about how they develop and what the primary drivers of change are at the different timescales. So we know, for example, that sea level rise is a key driver in long-term change, and we know that storm waves drive changes at the timescales of hours to days. So why do we need to put more research into the dune systems? Well, to begin with, we still don't understand a lot about change in the mesoscale. But also, importantly, a recent study led by Gert Masselink that focused on a subset of the making space for sand sites found that most of them have been receding over the past 15 years. And they also found that the changes in the dune foot position that you can see at the top plot here were decoupled from changes in beach volume that you can see at the bottom plot. Now, this is quite interesting because we generally associate erosion in the front of the dune with a lowering of beach or dune volume. Now, what we found in this study was that although this typical behavior did occur in those 2 instances highlighted in the red box, where we had the dunes propagating and at the same time increasing in volume shown at the top, or the dunes receding and reducing volume shown at the bottom plot in that red box. In most cases, we had erosion and accretion happening at the same time. So what was really happening, it seems, is that sediment from the front of your dune is eroding, but it's then being deposited at the top of the dune. Essentially, the dunes want to roll back. And this is a natural process, and it is nature's way of taking care of itself. And if the dune does have the space to move back, it will maintain its flood protection, it can still act as a buffer against erosion, and it can still support those habitats that are so important for biodiversity and nature conservation. But it does pose significant challenges for existing infrastructure, and that has kept you guys busy for the past 4 years. Another very unique characteristic of the Cornish dune systems is that they are very diverse. So we have a lot of climbing or perched dunes that have been inherited from a previous age, but are now completely disconnected from the beach and the sea. We have a lot of dune scarps that kind of inhibit the transport of sediment from the beach to the dune, as we generally perceive that we need to have at least a ramp to facilitate that. And a lot of our intertidal areas are very saturated, so again, that inhibits the transport of sand to the dunes. So we need to understand more how those very different dune systems will respond to sea level rise and to potential changes in storminess in the future. So how do we do that? Well, potentially the most widely used and a very simple approach is what's termed the Bruin rule. Now, this is essentially an equilibrium-based approach, and the underlying premise is that the active beach profile is in equilibrium with incoming wave conditions, so it will maintain its shape as sea level rises. To do this, it will also rise with the sea level, but it will then need to recede backwards to maintain, to conserve the mass of the sediment. Now, this is a very simplified approach, and one of the underlying assumptions here is that there is infinite supply of sediment beneath that active profile. Now, as we've seen in Cornwall, most of our dune systems are just perched on top of our underlying rock. So this assumption certainly doesn't hold. So Jack McCarroll and some of our colleagues from the Coastal Processes Research Group developed this model. It's called short trans, and they called it a rules-based model. It is, again, an equilibrium model that can consider substrate in its development. And what they found when they applied it to beaches was that actually the limitation of sediment means that the active profile needs to move even further back to conserve that mass. So essentially, limited sediment needs to exacerbate its erosion. Now, both of these models are very simple. They can be easily applied over wide spatial scales and across time scales, but they completely disregard the most important processes involved in dune evolution. And those that are particularly relevant to the Making Space for Sand projects are those constructive processes that lead to dune rollover. And those are primarily, or perhaps the most important of those, is wind-driven processes. So if we look a little bit at that, and considering the 355 days during which theoretically we have potential for wind-driven sediments, well, actually, let's take out those days where the wind isn't strong enough, or it's coming from the wrong direction, so it's not actually moving sediment from the beach onto the dunes. We kind of realize that we're left with less than half of those. And then if we remove those days where the tide is too high, so the beach is too narrow, so there's not enough space to get that sediment mobilized, or it's been raining, or there's too high a run-up because the waves are too energetic, at the end of the day, the potential for wind-driven sediment is quite small. Now, all of these processes are very site-specific, but the bottom line really is that there are many processes involved. There are many models that can replicate those processes, but there isn't one at the moment that can include all of these processes across different timescales. So how are we going to approach this? Well, we're going to have a layered, so to speak, approach. So as a first pass, we will apply Bruin modeling across all of our sites, and this is actually being done at the minute already. Further along the line, when we have a little more information about sediment thickness over the rock, we will also run short trans, again, across all of our sites. But then we will have to focus on a small number of them, 5 or 6 of them, and develop a new model that will include all the relevant processes like waves, tides, wind, sediment characteristics, moisture characteristics, to see how those dunes will actually develop in the long term, including all important processes. Now, of course, all the modeling is very demanding in terms of data, and we've heard everyone talking about how important data is. So we at the University of Plymouth, together with the Plymouth Coastal Observatory, will be collecting a lot of data. And this is just an example of how much data and what the types of data that we will be collecting throughout the project. Now, through this project, we will gain a unique understanding of how those very different dune systems will respond to sea level rise and to forcing. And that will help us raise awareness as to the physical impacts of sea level rise on dune systems, and that will also help us identify and pursue sustainable adaptation options that are both effective and acceptable by the public. And with that, I will thank you and leave you with Jolyon's favourite quote.
Yes, it is. I had developed another presentation which was Star Wars themed, and unfortunately I was told that I couldn't do it. So not by you guys, but anyway, it's a great saying from Cyril Khan and/or Series 1, Episode 2. There comes a time when the risk of doing nothing becomes the greatest risk of all. And I think that's where we are with this. We need to have the conversations now. We need to be working with communities now, because if we don't, the challenges we face in the future will be far more significant. So it's always nice to lean on Star Wars for something that will inspire you. So really, closing slide and a nod to Star Wars has to be done. So thank you very much for listening to us and for having us here. It's been a really great conference, really enjoyed it, and thank you to all the speakers thus far. It's been brilliant and worth attending. So thank you.
Thanks both of you for some amazing insights. So I think we have time for about maybe one or two questions. If anyone wants to query some of the things. Do we have any questions online? Maybe we do.
There's a couple online that relate to each other, considering generating dunes where there possibly wouldn't be them naturally, or there aren't any there currently. How is that approached? Do you consider artificial means of generating those sand dunes, or is the focus mostly on natural processes?
Do you want to?
In the majority of instances, we're looking to expand on where there are already dune systems or have historically been dune systems. I don't think we're going to be in a situation where we're looking to develop systems where there currently aren't any. So again, that links back to the historical use of locations. In many instances where we have development, there were dunes. So the coastline is effectively, or the coast is taking it back. So, but yeah, we'll be looking to work with natural processes where there are already natural processes.
We have a last one as well. What are the current challenges for encouraging the adoption of more sustainable practices regarding sand dune maintenance and regeneration?
I didn't provide the slide on challenges, but I think there's multiple challenges in that regard. I think I mentioned a few, but you need to have community support. They need to be engaged with that. And I think there needs to be an educational package associated with that. You know, the dunes are often seen as a bit of an extension of the playground at the beach, so there needs to be some strong messaging, which is why the champions are important. You need to have, of course, the landowners on board. There are some examples with some of the dune systems where they're owned by 7 or 8 people, and you need all of those parties to be involved in a solution. And sometimes the drivers aren't environmental. It might be that their ownership is one that's more economically focused. I think a real challenge as well is the short-termism that you might face as well, in that the benefits we get from the coastline now might be seen as more important as the long-term objectives of maintaining something into the future. And I think as well, you've got to look at the various challenges we have now as a nation, you know, with inflation, cost of living, and I think that sometimes can act as it can take away the focus of that longer term need to do something. So there's going to be numerous challenges, and I think that what we are going to need to do as a project is focus on those locations and work with those people that want to work with us. We have to ensure that we've got some good pilots, and then hopefully from those pilots bring more people round the table to talk about what we can do. That kind of helped answer.
Brilliant, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jolyon, and Kat. As both of you being our external speakers, we do have a little gift bag for you. I'm sure you've been looking forward to it. So I'll ask Isaac to bring that across, and enjoy the final talk. And I'm sure you'll have a great time chatting to everyone at lunch later. So thanks again for both of you.